Hello, and I'd like to welcome you to the Contentment podcast. This is the pilot episode, and today we're going to be talking about the subject, planting blessings. But before we get onto that subject, I'd like to say a little bit about what this podcast is about. It's about something that I've noticed in my own life, which is that when I have a free moment and I want to relax, maybe I finish work, or maybe I just want to lie in bed and listen to something before I go to sleep. I want something that's somewhat interesting, somewhat entertaining, somewhat informative, but I definitely don't want something which will create strong emotions, such as fear, such as worry, and that doesn't have strong opinions, and that won't be overtly political or creating some sort of division or high emotion. So I wanted to create something that, to me, would be the kind of thing that I would want to listen to. And that's what this podcast is. So if that resonates with you, thanks for joining me, and I hope it works out for you and that you enjoy it. As you know, this is called the Contentment Podcast, and just very briefly, to me, contentment means the ability to be satisfied with how things are right now as they are. And contentment, to me, is also incredibly important, because when you are content, you aren't particularly wanting anything. There's nothing that you feel deficient of when you feel content. There's nothing that you're particularly angry or concerned about. Happiness can be a little bit of a different kind of reaction. Happiness tends to be transient, whereas contentment is something that we can actually develop by building skills such as self-regulation, metacognition, and emotional intelligence. And by doing that, we can find that we often have more and more periods of contentment more often throughout our lives. So contentment is always going to be a theme throughout all of these podcasts. Everything that I talk about is about cultivating more contentment in life. So that's a bit about the podcast. Now here's a very short bit about me. Most of my working life, I've either been a clinical educator for mental health subjects or nursing students or in hospitals, or otherwise I've just been working as a mental health nurse. Obviously, that's just my background. As I mentioned, I'm interested in metacognition, self-regulation, and also spiritual or philosophical approaches that cultivate those sorts of subjects. So I try to look at what really helps and what works, rather than necessarily picking a school and defending that school. So hopefully you'll find this interesting. So on the subject of planting blessings now, what is this subject? What do I mean? Planting blessings is doing things that will pay a dividend in the future. When I talk about contentment in these podcasts, I always relate it back to a framework that I call readiness. And that's something you can always find out more about by looking in my bio. But it's not necessary to do that, because I'm going to cover a lot of what I talk about in readiness here in these podcasts. Readiness is a continuous process of growth with a number of tools to help us improve the chances that our time in the future will be more likely to be in contentment. Cultivate regulation, recognition of when we are discontent, and then we learn to sit with being discontent without acting on it. Not suppressing it, but being able to sit with it as it is. Because when we can see clearly what's happening, we understand it better, and we can respond to it rather than react and get swept away with it. The next part of the model is metacognition, where we begin to think about what sort of things trigger our discontent. We understand how we maintain our discontent, the subtle ways that we give it energy. And then we also look at where these processes grew from, And for those of you who are aware of cognitive behavioral therapy and Socratic questioning, that's where we look at the beliefs that we have learnt somewhere along the way, such as I must be successful or I must be likable, those sorts of things. And we get better and better, and this is a more advanced skill, at understanding some of the assumptions that drive our reactions. And we begin to question whether they're actually valid in a process called contemplation. And this entire process is driven by one thing: our understanding of what is beneficial. And in this podcast, there's one assumption which I guess you, as a listener, have to decide whether it's correct for you. That the most beneficial thing that you can do is maximize contentment in your life, and that anything that drives you towards discontent is not likely to be very beneficial for you. So the argument I'm creating here is that when you feel discontent because you want more, because you're trying to make things better, or because you're fighting what is, that discontent is not going to benefit you in the long term. Whereas anything that helps you deal with reality as it is, that builds your emotional intelligence to deal with reality as it is to your benefit. Because ultimately, life is going to bite us all on the bum. We're all going to get older. We're all going to have misfortunes. We're all going to have problems. And so, therefore, the ability to be emotionally intelligent and to be able to develop contentment, even in situations which seem like they would be anything but good, this acceptance is probably the most fundamental skill. So getting back to that subject of planting blessings then, what we're trying to do is the things that will help us in the future to be more content. And we do it for our own benefit. And so that's that in a nutshell. And to me, planting blessings falls into two categories. Probably the bigger one is the things that we should stop doing. Things that actually build discontent, that aren't necessarily emotionally intelligent, that don't support our self-regulation, or that don't use cognition or thinking about thinking. Things that encourage reactivity and old loops that don't create contentment. So that's the first one I'm going to talk about. And the second one is the things that we can do that will build contentment. Things that we might choose to do instead of the things that we're going to stop. So examples would be developing more gratitude and not dwelling on the future or the past, but redirecting our energy towards being kind to ourselves and to others, and developing understanding that everyone is going through difficulties and that we are sometimes going through difficulties. Understanding our situation now, how short life is, how limited our time is, how limited our energy is, recognizing our humanity, and within that, developing compassion and continuing to focus on building contentment and skillfulness so that our lives improve. And we can also invest in relationships that help us to do that. So those are the two avenues. So let's start again with avenue number one, the things that we should stop doing. To some extent, these should be obvious, but it's amazing how many times we can compartmentalize or be in denial about the things that are actually not benefiting us. So, some things that drive discontent: being constantly in debt, running up debt through unnecessary subscriptions or streaming services or content or social media that doesn't actually improve your mental state. You might have a YouTube subscription and your feed becomes nothing but division fear about the future or concern about AI or so on. And I'm not saying here that there is no value in being informed, but this doesn't necessitate constant exposure. So it could be cutting back on unnecessary debt, not giving money to corporations that don't necessarily have your well-being in mind. It could be being more sensible about the things that you buy. So it could be financial. It could be relational. It could be about recognizing there are people whose behavior, due to their own suffering and circumstances, may not be beneficial to you. So you may need to distance yourself from people or situations that drain your energy. Perhaps it's certain jobs or roles or commitments that increase stress or affect your sleep or increase your cortisol level, your stress hormones. Or maybe you need to create space for recovery and create space for growth. And I don't want this to sound like advice telling you what to do. What I'm asking you is to look for yourself at what does not support contentment in your life. There are no simple good or bad situations here. It's always nuanced. But the question is, what creates discontent? What's increasing chaos in your life? So there are so many examples, but another example might be addictions, sugar, substances, social media, or anything that drains money or attention. And then there's the more subtle patterns, mental habits that we fall into without awareness, without realizing. And the readiness process can help us identify these loops. For example, perhaps we worry too much. Perhaps we normalize being overwhelmed and operating outside our capacity. And by building our mindfulness, our self-regulation, we're more able to recognize this. And in readiness, I call this recognize with calm. And to create calm, we can use breathing, grounding, water on the face, scanning of our environments by looking to the left and then to the right, to simply remind ourselves that we are safe right here and now. And when we are calm, we can see the difference between what it is to be calm versus what it is to feel reactive and have a mind that is chaotic or busy. And then we begin to understand when we need to step back and do some self-care. So that is becoming aware of mental habits that we fall into. Because when we stay overstimulated, when we understand how important recovery, sleep, calm, and reducing stress load are, and operating within our bandwidth, not overdoing, overstressing ourselves. Those are all things that we do through stopping, by slowing down, by not overdoing it. So we cease and do less. And for those of you who are familiar in Buddhism, this is called renunciation. Now let's move on to that second subject. What we do instead. How do we plant blessings in action? So now we're going to discuss things that we actively do rather than the things that we don't do. And I'm going to refer to the structure that I use, readiness, and I'm just going to explain it briefly, just a couple of the acronym. So readiness is an acronym, and R stands for recognize. This is where we recognize discontent in the ways that it manifests. It can appear as unpleasant emotions, stomach sensations like tightness or anxiety, which appears in the stomach, or perhaps as headaches or migraines or other stress responses. But it can also appear in the mind as rumination, as worry, or in reactions in our experience. And as I said, I call this recognize with calm, because if we can introduce calmness, this allows us to notice what's happening for us without being so overwhelmed. And as I mentioned, calmness can come from many things, from time in nature, from cultivating gratitude, to bringing ourselves back to our breath, grounding ourselves in various ways. Or perhaps it's a simple orientation to the fact that we are right here and now safe. Because sometimes in our minds, it doesn't feel that way. The next parts of the acronym readiness are E and A, which stand for endure and accept. And this is where we recognize that we have a choice, that we don't have to feed our reaction. And if we don't suppress our reactions and we don't engage with them and follow them, many of our emotional reactions will naturally rise and they will naturally fall. There is research suggesting that the rise and fall can actually happen within 90 seconds if we don't keep our reactions alive. So you could think of it as a bit like a knock at your door, a knock at your front door. People can knock, but it doesn't mean you have to open the door. So I'll give you an example from today. We went to the swimming pool and we tried a door which was marked public entrance, but it was locked. And then an employee came and said that the entrance was actually around the corner. So it's a very small thing, but for some of us, and sometimes when we're under stress, small things like this can sometimes shape the rest of our day. And we could keep it alive by replaying it. We could be thinking about the signage. Why is there signage there? Or how embarrassed we feel. Or we could be asking ourselves, why don't they do something about that? In readiness, we call these maintaining factors. It's where the mind keeps on revisiting things and generating more energy to keep an event which has happened in the past alive in the present. So endure and accept means that we become conscious of how we may be generating more energy to keep that situation alive, and then consciously reducing the amount of energy that we put into it. Not feeding it, not following it, also not suppressing it. Just let it be present as a thing that's happening, but not feeding it. The D in readiness stands for discerning danger. And this is recognizing the danger of getting caught in discontent and loops like the one we just discussed. We ask ourselves, is it worth it? Does this reaction actually help my general direction that I want to be in? Does it help me move towards contentment? Sometimes we think that we should explain or fix a situation, and sometimes that helps. But sometimes it really doesn't. So discernment is learning when an action is useful and when letting go is actually more beneficial. And this is not something I can prescribe to you when you do something or you don't do something. This is something that you feel for yourself. I won't go into the rest of reading this here, but I just want to finish by returning to planting blessings. Self-regulation is planting a blessing. Emotional intelligence is planting a blessing. Discernment is planting a blessing. Also, simply staying orientated towards the general direction of building your own contentment and gently acting in that direction over time, that is also planting blessings. And when it works, and when we manage to return to calm, and when we notice that we handle things with more clarity, it's important to notice that, not necessarily as an achievement, but as a reinforcement of the direction that we're looking to go in. Because contentment is its own reward. And practically, planting blessings also means simplifying our lives, reducing unnecessary commitments, where possible, creating more space, investing in supportive relationships, taking care of our health and our bodies, and also looking after our mental well-being and stability. So I really hope that you've enjoyed this talk on planting blessings and also on contentment. And I hope it gives you something useful in your own way of looking at where you want to go to. Until next time.